Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual gathering place tonight. My name is Megan Kammer, and I'm the curator of exhibitions at the Visual Arts Center of Clarington. Tonight, I am so happy to welcome you all to the final iteration of our Incubator series, a project that was created and led by Sahar Te over the past 11 months. If you can believe it, it's been so long. Although you can no longer view this exhibition in person, further details, readings, and recordings on tonight's session and other parts of the project can be found on our website at vac.ca under the title Public Space, then navigate to the 2021 tab of our exhibition section. We will also share this link in the chat once it opens up at the end of the session for our Q&A. To welcome you all, Sahar is a Toronto-based artist and writer whose practice exists at the intersection of text, installation, and performance. Her practice mobilizes methods that open alternative realities and confront convention. Her multidisciplinary interest in sociology, politics, theater, literature, and acoustics inform her research-based projects. Her interventions also range from language and semiotics, social dynamics and ethics, to media studies and oral histories. Her projects engage in socio-political and techno-political discourses to understand hegemony within different power structures, while site-specific public artworks focus on counter-monuments, collective memory, and political contemplation. I'd like to acknowledge that the VAC is situated on the traditional territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and the signatory communities of the Williams Treaties, as well as other members of the broader Indigenous and Métis communities. August is a visitor on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the peoples of the Treaty 7 Nations in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Region 3 of southern Alberta. These meeting places are home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we recognize our responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live, work, and create. For me, I believe these acknowledgements are not to commemorate the past, as we continue to inform ourselves and our audiences about the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, land theft, and genocide in this country. So in doing so, we recognize our ongoing commitment to the present and the future. These acknowledgements really are living and will continue to live in all of us. So some house rules for this evening. Tonight's session is being recorded for those who are unable to join us live. We will be moderating the session behind the scenes to ensure the audience's video and microphones are turned off throughout our discussion, but we encourage you to save your questions for the end when we'll open the chat box for a Q&A session after August's presentation. If you cannot stay for the whole session, you can still submit questions by sending an email to communications, all lowercase, at vac.ca. This email is also available at the bottom of our website, so we can include your input at the end when we open up the floor. Closed captions are available in your settings below for folks who are at home live on Zoom, and will also be available in our streaming services. So be sure to keep out for them.
Thanks so much, Sahar and Megan, for setting the stage for this conversation. Thanks for inviting me. And of course, I'd like to thank the VAC for bringing me on board for this presentation. Before I go into screen share, I just wanted to say that Sahar and I met at AU Arts a few years ago, and I'm so delighted to have been invited by this artist who is a peer. So I thought I should also mention that I completed part of this research on Tlachtga, which is unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory, also known as Montreal, when I was at Concordia University as a graduate student. And I thought that it would be, interesting based on the remarks, the opening remarks, to pose the provocative question: does care have a taste or a flavor? Can we taste care? Because my presentation is going to be about this notion of the artist restaurant. What happens when artists open and maintain restaurants, even only for a couple of hours, in some cases, temporary restaurants are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. And this question is really based on a conversation that I once had with someone at the Banff Center who proposed to me that you can taste when there's love in food, when someone has cooked love into food. So I'm going to be kind of testing that as a proposal. So as was already introduced, I'm Dr. August Klintberg. My pronouns are he, him, and my PhD was focused on artist restaurants. I also have a studio practice that looks at queer histories and archives, edible artwork, the coding of sexuality and gender, and uses of public space. I wanted to show a couple of examples of still life painting from the 17th century because would you believe that still life paintings were actually my entry point into the notion of the artist restaurant? And the reason for that is because I started to believe that contemporary art that involves the service of food is a kind of performative still life where the audience becomes an active participant in disrupting and even ingesting the food that's on display. So that notion of performative still life is going to be in the background of today's presentation from case study to case study. I came to this topic of artist restaurants through my master's in art history, which was focused on the work of this artist, Felix Gonzalez Torres. In particular, I looked at his poster stacks and his candy spills. Here we see one untitled Placebo from 1991. So the idea of this work is that visitors can take a poster or a single candy, or many candies actually, with them as a gift. And I was drawn to this work in part because of practical experience working as a curatorial intern at the Rebel Family Collection in the early 2000s in Florida. The Rebels have one of his poster stacks in their collection, and when it was on display in the museum, I was always fascinated to see how hesitant visitors were to take this gift, to take the artist up on, and the institution up on this gifted poster. And if you're not familiar with the work, the institution or collection that owns one of these pieces has a contract to replenish the candy or poster supply indefinitely. So in my thesis, I studied the way that Gonzalez Torres injected political subterfuge into the tropes of minimalism, like this work, which references placebo trials for HIV/AIDS treatments that were taking place in the United States in the early 1990s and late 1980s as well. Ingestion is really important here because visitors take this candy, they either hold on to it or they actually put it directly into their mouth, reenacting the way that placebo tablets would have been taken. And I just wanted to state that my supervisor for this project was Dr. Cynthia Hammond, who I'd like to thank for her contributions to my project. That interest led to other forms of edible art practice in my PhD, which is supervised by Dr. Joanne Sloan. So here I really started to get into the notion of the artist-run restaurant. And like I said, the genre of still life was a kind of interpretive node for looking at these practices, how these restaurants frame and display food experiences. And here we see two interconnected case studies that I'm going to get into in much more detail later on. First, El Bulli, a molecular gastronomy restaurant that was featured in Documenta 12 as an off-site exhibition, really off-site in Spain instead of in Germany. And this molecular gastronomy laboratory, that's not a typo, it's gastronomy, a project by a queer collective that wanted to use molecular gastronomy as an analog for queer bodily experience. So like I said, I'll be diving more into those in a bit. But the first case study that I wanted to address in detail here is Karen Tam's series, Golden Mountain Restaurants, a project that is ongoing and started in 2002. These are temporary installations that resemble what Tam refers to as prototypical Chinese Canadian restaurant interiors. And they're constructed from materials located by local communities, the locale of whatever gallery or institution is showing the work, who also are invited to bring any type of food they like to the site to share. Many of Karen Tam's artworks do involve and refer to commoditized food, and her projects are, I would say, complicating the relationship between food commodities, regional identities, and architecture. She's created several installations of temporary restaurant interiors inside of galleries and museums. And the spaces that she builds are these careful recreations of a 1960s kind of Chinese Canadian restaurant that include dining areas and kitchens. And the projects are currently around a dozen in number that all fall under the title a Golden Mountain restaurant, and then have these different individual titles like On Rock Garden, piece that we see here. Chinese food or Chinese Canadian food is not necessarily served in these spaces, but Golden Mountain restaurants always put on display many commodities and really edible commodities with different cultural associations. They're decorated with mid-20th century furnishings that might be considered kitsch by some, which are provided by the surrounding community. So donors to this project and its decor include restaurants and former restaurant owners, local businesses and local community groups like theater troupes, which all donate items to Karen Tam's cause. The decor that she's harvested from these for these series include things like bakelite wall clocks, bright green bamboo awnings, mass-produced wood and red paper lanterns, folding tables with faux wood veneer, coral-colored tablecloths, large red and black painted wall murals of Chinese insignia, chrome and upholstered chairs, custom-made menus and placemats, and really hundreds of other objects. So I was lucky enough to interview Tam about this arrangement that she had with these different communities in making the work. And when questioned, she replied, quote, "When I first started the project at Khyber Center for the Arts in Halifax, I decided to give myself the challenge of going to these spaces with almost nothing. I got in touch with the local high schools, theater companies, and local restaurants, and sometimes from retired restaurateurs. They like to bring more than one thing back from their restaurants as mementos. For current restaurants, I remember it was hard to get stuff because what they have, they are using. But we did have a few places that did provide tables and chairs. One of the oddest places I got stuff from in Lethbridge for the exhibition of the Southern Alberta Art Gallery was from a bowling alley that went out of business. So, I mean, I think that Karen Tam is kind of a material omnivore for this project, like really looking for whatever materials might cross her path. Tam believes that the restaurant owner, who may or may not be of Chinese origin, selects particular decor to satisfy the visitor's desires and expectations of a Chinese Canadian restaurant, in quotation marks. And Tam is uniquely experienced in such matters because her family operated a Chinese Canadian restaurant in Montreal during her childhood and restaurant. The hybridity of Tam's project has important links with specific instances of still life, I believe, because the commodities and edible commodities included in Tam's project come together by the very same rationale that commodities very often come together in still life, through the chance of commodity circulation. These objects are put on display in Tam's performative still life arrangement because they've already been brought together through and circulate within a capitalist marketplace. They also come together because of aesthetic stereotypes associated with Asian identity, decor, and food service, which are determined by the donating locales that Tam accesses. I mean, remember that one of the donating locales that she often accesses are these kind of theater troupe and community troupe groups that are donating sets and props that have come from previous productions. So that brings us to the next framing device that I'd like to use as we consider these examples, which is really the notion of the museum itself. Because some of the case studies that we're going to be looking at today are framed within the architecture of the gallery or the museum. So that brings us to Tony Bennett and this, I think, quite wonderful book, The Birth of the Museum from 1994, which is nonetheless still useful today. So his text is a kind of origin story for today's museum. And I am troubled by origin stories because I think they often oversimplify things, but nonetheless, I think that this narrative is interesting for unpacking the way that museums often function, the way that museums often think of themselves today. Because it's a source that helps us to understand the issues of sensory and social participation in museums, including edible and drinkable artworks. Bennett explains that at the end of the 19th century, historians praised the museums of their era as being infinitely superior to the 17th century's cabinets of curiosity, because unlike these earlier private collections that were often held in private residences, the museum was an organized and rational space that was also publicly accessible. Remember that these cabinets of curiosity, or Wunderkammer, had very particular rules of sensory engagement. Wunderkammer were privately owned collections, and visitors to these collections were invited, but they were also very often given special authorities to touch, smell, and even taste some of the rare objects on display. Like licking a piece of coral was not an unusual activity when visiting a 17th century Wunderkammer. So you'll notice, by the way, that this is a painting. This is a trompe-l'oeil painting of Wunderkammer rather than a photograph of an actual 17th century Wunderkammer. When museums opened to what we might call the general public, new rules, of course, were required because the licking and tasting and smelling of paintings probably wouldn't have very positive impacts from a conservation standpoint. So 19th century museums had to reckon with the conduct of a new group of visitors. That entity referred to loosely as the public. Other sites facing this problem at the time, Bennett notes, were places like railways and public exhibitions, not art exhibitions, but world's fairs, that kind of thing, and department stores. So this was an issue of behavior management and involved the imposition of new rules for bodily comportment, including rules against touching and tasting, especially. Bennett also studies the phenomenon of amusement fairs in comparison to museums. These are both public sites of entertainment for Bennett. I think that's really interesting to actually begin with the notion of a museum as just a place for entertainment. Of course, it's also meant to be a place for the circulation and sharing and the making of knowledge. In the late 19th century, the general opinion of sociologists was that amusement parks and fairs had pacified the public by distracting them with entertainment. Museums, it was hoped, at least by some, could provide greater educational value than amusement parks, and also maybe train visitors in moral and aesthetic ideals. In other words, when it came to satisfying and controlling populations, preventing them from getting into trouble, most citizens actually preferred amusement parks. That brings us to ale houses and gin joints, as they were referred to in the 17th and 18th centuries. Places where the consumption of alcohol was permitted. These were also very popular attractions in England through the middle of the 18th century and at the end of the 19th century. These are times that coincide with the founding and the expansion of the museum as a project. You can see in this print by Hogarth just the sort of conditions that concerned governments in this period. In fact, this print is inscribed with a note that it was created in accordance with an act of parliament. So this is a kind of effort to educate the masses about the dangers of gin. It was a kind of public relations poster or an advert for morality. Over time, or pardon me, at the time, gin, in fact, was much cheaper than other forms of alcohol and had much higher alcohol content by volume, which perhaps encouraged people to drink with less than pious moderation. So this public relations poster, this public ad campaign is trying to warn people of the dangers involved in consuming gin. The government of England was nervous about the vice that they suspected was being supported through the consumption of alcohol. And this is tied to an ongoing debate at the time about how to improve the lives of people that were, in the eyes of parliamentarians, not just turning to alcohol for entertainment or for pleasure, but because they were alcoholics. So as Bennett reports, this government had the idea that using cultural means, things like museums, could go very far, actually, in kind of ethically and morally remodeling the masses. So Tony Bennett writes, and I quote, 19th century reformers thus typically sought to enlist high cultural practices for a diversity of ends, as an antidote to drunkenness, as an alternative to riot, or an instrument for civilizing the morals and manners of the population, end quote. And I think it's really important to drive home the point that these were museums where taste and touch were not being mobilized. The hope was, as somewhat facetiously stated by a pundit in 1858, that, quote, The anxious wife will no longer have to visit different tap rooms to drag her poor besotted husband home. She will seek for him at the nearest museum, where she will have to exercise all the persuasion of her affection to tear him away from the rapt contemplation of a Raphael, end quote. So that takes us on to this gradual process of the museum becoming, in quotations, a multisensory environment, which coincides with increasing sensory latitudes in modernist art of the early 20th century. For example, the work of the Italian futurists, who founded their very own restaurant called the Holy Palate in Turin in 1931, where they held banquets and served feasts. And I think this is such an interesting case study because it's a case where artists basically wanted to do something that wouldn't be permitted inside of a museum environment. So they made their own environment. They made their own architecture. Actually, they took over a former restaurant and turned it into their restaurant. So it was a retrofitted restaurant, originally run by a different proprietor. And the futurists made many changes. The menu was transformed, it was redecorated, and it became, for a short while, one of Turin's new cultural hubs. They hosted poetry readings, contests, fashion shows, and of course, many banquets. But they didn't stop with restaurants. They also published their own cookbook in 1932. The Futurist Cookbook is described by the art historian Leslie Chamberlain. It was not a collection of recipes, but a disguised artist games full of ideas for avant-garde experiments. And I agree with that. However, the thing is that there were actual recipes in it, and recipes that any of us could make to this day. The introduction to the cookbook reads, "Today, our refined sensibility requires a complete artistic study of cooking. We must fight puddles of sauce and disordered heaps of food." So this was an aesthetic project. It was about reconsidering and re-aestheticizing food in Italy and possibly beyond too. So I've included one recipe, fire in the mouth, which is actually a very delicious aperitif if any of you are interested in making one. The futurists wanted to elevate the everyday nature of foodstuffs from the lowly to the lofty and show that food is politically important because it's something that we encounter every single day. So they wanted to transform the diet of Italians. In fact, the futurists were very much against pasta as a primary dietary or nutritional source, and they wanted to do away with Italian pasta and instead have Italians eat risotto, which was for geopolitical reasons that I can get into in the Q&A if people are interested. So getting rid of pasta was really important. Wait, actually, I'm just going to go into it now because it's in the notes. So pasta, they believed, caused slow and sluggish behavior. And so they were kind of like early proponents of the keto diet, I guess. They were really against the carbohydrate load of pasta. And this is tied to Mussolini's own insistence that Italians needed to reduce their intake of pasta because it required using imported wheat. And so instead, he wanted to suggest that Italians should eat risotto because they had so much rice available in their domestic markets. And in fact, Mussolini and Marinetti, they knew each other. They got arrested at the same illegal fascist demonstration. So I think that that's another important dimension of futurism to keep in mind, which is that most Italian futurists were very much involved in the fascist party. And when we look at these artist restaurants, it really is important to keep in mind that politics come along for the ride. When we're looking at foodways, we're looking at political ways. Marinetti even went so far as to call for a ban on foreign food words like consommé, which he wanted to replace with consumato. So there are all kinds of invented Italian futurist food terms. As I said, the recipes are real recipes. You can make them, you can look them up later on if you want. I've included two that I've made myself. This is documentation from my graduate research, which was supported by the Concordia University Art History Student Association. So the first one is white rose on the left, which is orangeade, Campari, anise, and a white rose, an actual rose on top of the drink. And then this other one, like a cloud, is cream, orange juice, mint, and strawberry jam, and asti spumanti. There is another one that I haven't included documentation of that was very unpopular at my tasting back in 2010. It included grappa and pulverized hard-boiled egg yolk. Yeah, not the most popular drink at the event. That brings us on to this work by Tahltan Nation artist Peter Morin called Team Diversity, World's Largest Bannock Attempt, which was a one-day performative meal event and Guinness Book of World Records attempt organized by Peter Morin and held in the public park surrounding the Britannia Community Center on Commercial Drive in Vancouver. So during the event, the artist and his volunteer assistants cooked bannock, a type of fried quick bread, and they distributed it to the public free of charge. So this assembled team of chefs and assistants cooked an over 10-foot massive, 10 massive pieces, each over 5 foot long and 2 feet wide. The artist used the resulting media attention, however, though, in a really unexpected way. He used the spectacle as an opportunity to speak out publicly concerning a political impasse that was taking place in Telegraph Creek, British Columbia. The conflict was centered on the traditional territory of the Indigenous Tahltan Nation, a community that Morin remains active in, although I believe he now lives in Victoria. So as Morin explained in interview, the traditional territory of the Tahltan Nation is the largest in BC. Up until this point, they've had resource extraction going on in the territory for over 30 years, over 50 if you include big game hunters coming in for sport. So I continue to quote him. They had a chief who was signing all these exploratory deals with mining companies. So the elders decided to occupy the band office. I knew that if I made the world's largest bannock, I would get some media coverage and I would be able to talk about what the elders were doing. So that's the end of my quotation of him. So Morin created this artwork in reply to this controversy about the extraction of resources to be transformed into commodities. Again, tying into these ideas of still life representations of commodities in 17th century still life painting. So there had been these negotiations with a company called Fortune Minerals to drill at the Mount Kaplan coal fields, and Nova Gold Resources, which hoped to drill nearby Galore Creek. Both of these mine sites are on Tahltan Nation land. And a group of elders disagreed with Chief P. Jerry Asp's position on negotiations with Nova Gold, and they held a months-long sit-in at the band office in protest. So the curator, Lisa Myers, further describes the details of this conflict in Telegraph Creek. She writes that, and I quote, demanding a meeting with their chief, the Tahltan elders demonstrated for over 8 months, contesting controversial band council decisions made without community consultation or environmental assessments for the development of resource extraction ventures. Now, bannock, a food often popularly considered, and I'm quoting here from a publication, a traditional food of First Nations peoples, was used in this artwork as a spark for a media event. So this is in the publication Bannocology, which was compiled and edited by the artist after this banquet. And in that publication, bannock is described as, quote, the ubiquitous bread that is part of every First Nation social event, private or public, end quote. That's in the artist's own words. Bannock, which is generally made domestically and from scratch, may be described as the extreme opposite of the archetypal food commodity, something like brand name sliced white bread, like Wonder Bread, a commodity available in supermarket chains. But all of this is to say that bannock may seem an entirely uncommoditized foodstuff. But Morin uses bannock as a point of leverage for a discussion about the creation and circulation of commodities and commodity extraction. It would be difficult to do a presentation about artist restaurants without at least making passing reference to this artist, Rirkrit Tirvanit. So this artist has created and served food in tea houses, supermarkets, street stalls, gallery offices, museum galleries, and on the side of roads, all as examples of what I would like to call performative still life. A pivotal work for this artist in that body of work is the piece from 1992 titled Untitled 1992 Free, for which he moved the entire contents of the offices of a commercial gallery into its exhibitions area. And he converted the offices into a food service site open to the public. So vessels, cooking equipment, and utensils used during Untitled 1992 Free were left on display in the space as a record of the dining experiences and experiments that took place there. Visitors were invited to come in, relax, converse, and be served a meal made by the artist. By inviting visitors to socialize and effectively loiter inside of a commercial space, to an extent, Tirvanit repurposed the commercial setting of this gallery as a free food service site that in some ways seemed to be entirely decommoditized. Because he presents Thai cuisine to visitors, this artist's work can be understood in relationship to questions of identity, at least at some level. Beyond simple conviviality, the food served in this artwork was Thai curry, a dish that we could say serves as a kind of resilient totem of Thai food culture. That's using the terminology of Roland Barthes. So this piece could also be considered as a kind of artist's self-portrait, or perhaps even a form of autoethnography. Some artists writing about this work seem to suggest that by serving green curry and pad thai, the artist is also serving forth his ethnic identity, sort of putting it on display. The artist's work also offers some participants a type of food tourism experience, though, of course, others might experience this meal as a mark of their own ethnic identity. So during this 1992 piece, the artist served two kinds of green curry in one space. One was cooked by the method used by many New York-based Thai restaurants, and the other was, as the artist described it, quote, authentically made Thai curry, end quote. The artist relies on an understanding of this food's indelible, not inedible, indelible link to Thai identity, and taking stock in what Barthes calls food's facility to be a resilient totem of identity. So Tirvanit continues, I was working on the idea of food, but in a kind of anthropological and archaeological way. It was a lot about the layers of and taste of otherness, end quote. Since this artist is of Thai descent, if this work follows an anthropological method, it appears to be autoanthropology or autoethnography. The latest version of this piece, now titled Untitled Free Still, was acquired and exhibited by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2012, revealing that the artist's act of food generosity is certainly one that can be commoditized and purchased. Its new title alludes both to the connection this piece has to the genre of still life and to the perennial promise of free food, like free food forever, free food still. Of course, let's get real. Nonetheless, for most audience members, there are costs involved in experiencing the piece. First of all, potentially the cost of traveling to New York to experience it. But at the very least, in 2013, for example, the admission fees, that's the year after the work was acquired, the admission fees for entry into this institution were $25 US for adults, $18 US for seniors, and $14 US for students. Roughly the same price as pad thai in most restaurants in the same neighborhood. With the exception of Friday evenings between 4 and 8 p.m., when the museum grants free admission to visitors, this work free still, in fact, will mostly not be free at all whenever it's exhibited there. So no free gift. The artwork is in fact an edible commodity with a price tag. That brings us to this example and the final case study that I'm going to be introducing tonight by this collective Queer Food for Love, an artist collective of, as you see here, queer artists, activists, and cooks. So the project that we're going to be looking at is Molecular Gastronomy Laboratory. And the photos that I'm showing you today are taken by Anthea Black, who's a colleague. Actually, we studied together at ACAD, the Alberta College of Art and Design, now AU Arts, back in the late 90s. Pardon me. So in this work, this queer collective decides to turn to the tropes of molecular gastronomy and to give away examples of molecular gastronomy to the public, all as a lure to have conversations about something else. You can see this is a recurring theme throughout the work, like food as a lure. They had a little handout alongside their service station that read as follows: "Welcome to the world of hydrocolloids, a substance that forms a gel in contact with water, forming edible gels, foams, and spheres using proteins and polysaccharides. All of these hydrocolloids are of biological origin, from algae, seaweed, beets, and soy, vegan and edible. Science tells us we can eat them. They are nature squared. You decide. See, smell, taste, feel as science transforms seasonal summer ingredients into something very queer indeed." I mean, imagine going to a restaurant and reading on the menu that you were going to be eating hydrochlorides, proteins, and polysaccharides. I think that might be a bit of a head scratcher for you. But in all of these techniques that they're using about spherification and foaming and gels, they're picking up on some of the technologies used in a now somewhat more infrequently discussed food trend that emerged in the early 2000s. And I think, people are still eating and cooking in this way, but perhaps the star has fallen around molecular gastronomy a little bit. But one of the big sources of ideas connected to molecular gastronomy was this restaurant run by Fran Adria called El Bulli. And it was a restaurant that used many of the same technologies used to make things like Cool Whip, Cheese Whiz, Doritos, to make these haute cuisine dishes using very fine and expensive ingredients. So actually, I'm just going to get this video started for you to show you the theatricality of the dining experience at El Bulli. It's a set menu of more than 24 different courses that are served over the span of several hours. A meal there before it closed was roughly $500 Canadian, and you would have to book as far as a year in advance, and bookings were made through a kind of lottery process, but also a process of persuasion. So I was lucky enough to secure a reservation by emphasizing that my graduate thesis, which was supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada, was about artist restaurants, and specifically I was dealing with El Bulli as a case study. Not only that, but I was bringing in a kind of dream team of researchers with me for a table of 6, including a neuroscientist, somebody that works for the World Health Organization in terms of food and nutrition, a graphic designer, and a pastry chef. So I had this kind of like team of people. Somehow I thought that would work. Actually, there were 5 of us, not 6. And it did. So I managed to get a table. Thank you, Shirk, for funding this meal. And yeah, I mean, the experience was an important one because some of it was really revolting. Actually, I chose this slide to show you because this was by far the worst thing that we ate the entire night. It was a giant sphere of frozen gorgonzola cheese that was dressed with nutmeg. And I mean, there are so many problems with this. I have so many problems with this just from a food and cooking standpoint. I mean, freezing cheese is already a bad idea, I think, and it really did not go well. I'd say it was a total failure as a dish. However, most of the other things that we tasted were wonderful, and every one of them were surprising because we didn't order. It was a set menu, and the descriptions for most of the dishes were very brief, like sometimes one word like air. A dish would just be called something like air. And so you wouldn't really know what it was. And the process of eating it was one of discovery and continual surprise. And that takes us on to Queer Food for Love's interest in molecular gastronomy as a vehicle for discussions about queer bodily experience. Because, if we think about the ideas of someone like Judith Butler, who says that sexuality and gender exist in time and space, I think that lends us a hand in imagining molecular gastronomy as some kind of parallel to queer bodily experience. For me, the power of queerness and the power that I experience in my own queerness is about continual questioning and continual surprise and research strategies of ambiguity and strangeness and things like gossip, things that are on the move and continually changing. Also, queerness can be frightening, even for us queers, and can involve risk-taking as part of its surprise. So taking a risk about putting that strange gelatinous effluvia kind of material into your mouth, I think is a really fascinating parallel for what it means, at least for me, to be queer. I always like to show this follow-up image because I think it's also quite beautiful. There's something in this network, this kind of, dare I say, rhizomatic structure, thinking about mushrooms, of this sponge sugar that goes across all of these beautiful flowers. And that brings us to the final slide that I wanted to show to conclude my talk, which is this very simple still life painting that nonetheless includes some rather deluxe silverware in it. So what I wanted to do with this last slide is just raise the ideas of an art historian named Hanneke Groetenboer, who was my tutor in my time at Oxford. And she wrote this marvelous book called The Rhetoric of Perspective. And in it, she identifies two different, or I guess like two opposing forms of still life in 17th century Northern Europe. These very simple breakfast pieces alongside their kind of polar opposite, these sumptuous pronk still lives that are full of all of these sumptuous commodities, many of them expropriated from places of colonization and oppression. And what she does in the book is she points out that a pronk still life, one of great sumptuousness, draws us in and convinces us through arousing our appetites and exciting us so much with all of the different objects and commodities on display. So we're sort of taken in by our appetite, by our extreme appetite, and by the luxuriousness of the image. And then these other breakfast pieces in their simplicity, they convince us because it seems as if there's nothing hidden inside of the image. It's actually through its simplicity, like there must be nothing more to this image than a simple representation. And I think that the case studies that I've shown today kind of skew back and forth between these two polarities, convincing us of the simplicity of the meal, the basicness of the idea, or the basicness of the political cause is so straightforward that we should immediately consume it or be convinced by it. And then the opposite of, I'd say like with Queer Food for Love, for instance, suggesting all of this complexity, this rhizomatic quality as another form of drawing us in, like, wow, this idea is so big that it convinces us in its vastness. So thank you so much for your attention and just for your presence. It's really been wonderful to be able to share some of this research with you. And I'm always looking for other case studies. It seems like every time that I present on this topic, people say, oh, well, have you heard about this restaurant or that restaurant or this new artist that's working in this? So I'd love to hear from you folks about that. And of course, I also welcome questions that you might have or comments.